So we know that Woodrow Wilson won the 1912 election, and it was certainly not a landslide election, and he won with his plan called New Freedom. His plan included to fight the evils of society, what he believed were the evils of society. Tariffs, he wanted to lower tariffs so they were a more manageable tax so that it would lower the cost of some of these goods. He wanted to break up trust. He believed that all trusts were bad, whereas Teddy Roosevelt believed that some were good and some were bad. Woodrow Wilson believed that all trusts were bad, and he wanted to break them all up. This is really going to appeal to many common people because most commoners or most of your average Americans believe that all trusts were bad and that it was bad for consumers or those monopolies. He wanted to regulate the banks. He believed that banks were taking too many liberties with people's money, so he wants to regulate them. And with poverty, disease, and corrupt government, he wanted to end all of these. So again, these were his goals with his plan, his domestic policy, which was New Freedom. Make sure you make a note that New Freedom was the name of Wilson's domestic policy. Wilson is going to be unique in that he's going to address Congress in person. You see him right here making an address to Congress. This is going to be his way of using the presidency as the bully pulpit to get what he wants. And it's successful. He gets tariffs lowered for the first time since the Civil War. Remember, we talked previously that lowering tariffs had been a major goal of many presidents and they had just been unsuccessful. So the fact that he was able to do this with the Underwood tariff, which is going to attack that issue of tariffs and get them lowered for the first time since the Civil War, was a major, major undertaking and a major victory for Wilson. But at this point in time, tariffs were the government's main source of revenue. So all of that revenue had to be replaced with something. This is where the income tax comes in. The income tax is going to be created by the 16th Amendment, and the income tax soon becomes the government's main source of revenue, and we still pay income tax today. That's what you pay every year, April 15th. So again, the 16th Amendment is going to create the income tax. You might want to draw a line from 16th Amendment to income tax, so you'll make sure to remember that. The Federal Reserve was also created by Woodrow Wilson. He realized that the government needed to be able to control our money supply, our paper money. So what he does is he's going to establish what's called the Federal Reserve that sets up a system of 12 national banks. These national banks are responsible for not only printing and circulating our money, but also setting the interest rates. This is an extremely important part of our economy today, and those 12 national banks are still around today. This is going to help stabilize our currency and make it more valuable and gives the government more control over the flow of money in our economy. He's also going to regulate trusts. He is going to create the FTC, or Federal Trade Commission, in 1914. This agency's job, which you see the seal at the top there, could investigate various businesses, and then if it was needed, he could regulate them as well. Again, this was going to be very popular with average Americans because, like you see here, they felt like Woodrow Wilson, who is seen here, who's putting up this antitrust or anti-monopoly fence, was protecting your small businesses down here from your big monopolies, your big trust. So people really liked the fact that he was moving in the direction of protecting their interest over the interest of big business. He's also going to get past the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. This was a much stronger law and was built on the precedent of the Sherman Antitrust Act. This particular law was much stronger than the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it also is going to specifically protect labor unions, whereas the Sherman Antitrust Act oftentimes even allowed those big businesses to go after labor unions. This one's going to be a much stronger law and is going to protect them. So this law makes it easier to break apart those big business monopolies that had been created. Suffrage was one of the major progressive reforms. Don't forget that suffrage means right to vote. If you didn't remember that, I want you to write that down again. Suffrage means right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt becomes the leader of the modern suffrage movement and is going to lead this movement for a federal amendment. There were some members of the suffrage movement that are going to go towards more militant efforts as opposed to what was considered at the time more feminine efforts. So they are going to do things that were much more aggressive than previous women suffragists had done. And you're going to see an example of that today in a clip of some of these women who not only went on strike and picketed in front of the White House itself, but they also, when they were jailed, they went on a hunger strike as well. So we'll talk about them too. But what really eventually gets women the right to vote was the fact that they supported the efforts in World War I. In World War I, when all the men went off to war, your women were left on the home front to run our factories and our manufacturing in order to keep the war effort moving. So this was going to be what eventually gets them that right to vote with the 19th Amendment. When you evaluate the progressive movement as a whole, we see that laissez-faire, or the hands-off policy of the government, is definitely going to fade. That laissez-faire, or no regulation, is going to begin to go away as the government begins to place more regulations on various businesses. There were many social reforms that were put in place that are going to help many Americans as well, mostly the poor and a lot of immigrants too. Women finally get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Unfortunately, African Americans are going to be completely ignored as a whole by the progressive movement. So we see that they were still working on those goals, but that it wasn't a part of the overall progressive movement. So while there are advances being made during this period, it wasn't by the progressives overall. It was by those various individual civil rights leaders and groups that were pushing for those reforms. When World War I enters the world stage, when this becomes the focus, the Great War becomes the focus of many politicians, and eventually when the United States gets involved, it is going to end these reforms. The reason being is that we could not afford to fully fund a war and be successful at that war, and also fund all of the domestic reform programs here on the home front. So when the choice had to be made, the money is going to go to fund the war instead. This is a very common theme and a common occurrence that happens anytime we have a lot of reforms that seem to be interrupted by a major conflict.